The night Evelyn Dawson realized her place in her daughter's life, the world around her seemed to shift in a way she couldn't fully understand. Not suddenly or violently, but slowly, like a quiet crack forming beneath the surface of a frozen lake. She had spent the whole day preparing a small dinner, something warm and comforting, something that carried the smell of home, because she believed, perhaps foolishly, that love could still be cooked into a meal. When she set the table, she placed everything carefully: the soft napkins her daughter liked, the silverware she had polished by hand, the candle she only lit on special evenings. She knew Grace had been exhausted lately, burdened by work, responsibility, and the noise of adulthood, and Evelyn wanted to give her one evening where the world felt a little lighter. But when Grace walked through the door, shoulders stiff, jaw tight, and eyes already clouded with unspoken frustration, Evelyn sensed the shift immediately. She tried to smile anyway, stepping forward with that gentle warmth she had refined over decades, but Grace barely glanced at her. As they sat at the table, the silence between them grew thick, almost suffocating, as though the air itself could feel something important coming. And then, without warning, Grace set down her fork, looked Evelyn directly in the eyes, and said the words that would carve themselves into her mother's memory forever. "Mom, you're last in my life." There was no hesitation, no tremble, no softness. Just truth, cold, sharp, and merciless. The room seemed to shrink around Evelyn. The candle's flame flickered as if startled. Her hands froze mid-motion, the warmth draining from her fingertips. For a moment, she wondered if she had misheard. If maybe stress had twisted Grace's words into something crueler. But Grace kept talking, explaining how she had too much to handle, how she needed space, how Evelyn's presence felt heavy, inconvenient, overwhelming. Evelyn listened in silence, her heartbeat echoing loudly inside her chest like a slow, painful drum. She wanted to ask how a mother could be last in the life she had given everything to build. She wanted to remind Grace of the nights she stayed up sewing last-minute costumes, the mornings she skipped meals to afford school lunches, the holidays she worked overtime so Grace wouldn't feel the absence of a father who never came back. But instead she simply nodded, as mothers often do, choosing quiet dignity over desperate pleading. When dinner ended, Grace disappeared into her room, and Evelyn washed the dishes alone, hands trembling under the warm water, tears sliding silently into the sink. She dried her hands carefully, almost mechanically, as if performing the ritual could keep her from falling apart. Later, when she lay in the small guest room her daughter had given her temporarily, she stared at the ceiling and replayed the moment again and again. The calm tone, the steady eyes, the finality. Outside, the world continued in its usual rhythm. Cars passing, neighbors laughing faintly, the streetlight flickering. But inside Evelyn's chest, something had shattered softly. And as she closed her eyes that night, one question echoed louder than the rest. How does a mother learn to accept that the person she loves most has placed her at the very end of their life? The next morning, Evelyn woke with the same heaviness sitting in her chest, a weight that didn't lift with sunlight or warmth or sleep, but instead seemed to grow deeper, as if her daughter's words had settled into her ribs overnight and carved themselves into her bones. She lay still for a moment, listening to the faint sounds of life happening behind the walls, running water, footsteps, the clatter of something falling in the kitchen. And she wondered if Grace felt even a fraction of what she had felt the night before. But when Evelyn finally gathered the courage to step out of the small guest room, the air in the house felt cooler, distant, as though the walls themselves had absorbed her daughter's coldness. Grace sat at the table with a cup of coffee, scrolling through her phone, her expression tight, her shoulders tense, and when she looked up at Evelyn, there was no remorse, no regret, only exhaustion, as if the mere act of seeing her mother standing there required more patience than she had left. "Morning," Evelyn whispered softly, but Grace only nodded, expression unreadable, eyes already drifting back to the glowing screen in her hand. Evelyn poured herself some tea with slow, deliberate motions, careful not to make noise, careful not to disturb the fragile peace Grace seemed to cling to. Every movement felt like walking on glass. Every breath felt like a quiet apology. They sat together in silence, two people who shared blood, but suddenly seemed like strangers occupying the same house. After a few minutes, Grace spoke, not looking up, her tone clipped and cold. "I'm going out later. You should. Maybe find something to do." Evelyn paused, hands tightening slightly around her mug. "Of course," she said, though she wasn't sure where she was supposed to go or what she was supposed to do. She wanted to ask if they could talk, really talk, but Grace's body language made it clear the conversation was closed. So Evelyn stepped outside into the soft morning light, walking slowly down the street, her sweater pulled tightly around her frail shoulders, the quiet neighborhood feeling both familiar and foreign. She passed homes where families were loading kids into cars, sharing hurried morning kisses, waving goodbye with warm smiles, and each scene felt like a reminder of something she had lost without realizing it. Something she had assumed would always be hers. She wandered until her legs ached, until the morning sun climbed higher, until she felt the sting of tears she refused to let fall. By the time she returned to the house, the driveway was empty. Grace was gone. Inside, the silence felt louder than any words could have been. Evelyn sat on the couch, staring at a framed picture of Grace as a child, the little girl who once clung to her mother's hand, who cried when Evelyn left for work, who believed her mother was the safest place in the world. How had that child grown into a woman who could look her mother in the eyes and say she was last? The question pulsed like a slow, dull ache. As the afternoon light faded, Evelyn moved through the house doing small things, folding blankets, wiping counters, tidying spaces, not because it was expected of her, but because it was all she knew how to do, all she had done her entire life. Make a home feel warm, feel loved, feel lived in. But now each act felt meaningless, like polishing a room she no longer belonged in. When Grace finally returned that evening, she looked surprised, almost irritated, to find Evelyn sitting quietly near the window. She avoided eye contact, heading straight to her room, and Evelyn didn't follow. She didn't ask questions. She didn't plead. She simply sat there, hands folded in her lap, trying to understand when the shift had happened, when love had quietly transformed into obligation, when presence had turned into burden, when a mother had become an afterthought. And as night fell again, wrapping the house in shadows, Evelyn realized something painful, something she had never wanted to believe. Sometimes heartbreak doesn't come from strangers or enemies. Sometimes it comes from the people you raised with your whole heart. Over the next several days, Evelyn moved through the house like a quiet shadow, present but unnoticed, breathing but unheard. A mother who had spent her entire life giving pieces of herself away, now reduced to someone who took up too much air in her daughter's world. She tried, desperately, gently, silently, to find small ways to reconnect, to soften the growing distance between them. She made breakfast even though Grace rarely ate at home. She folded laundry that wasn't hers. She placed fresh flowers in the living room, hoping the familiar fragrance of lilies, Grace's childhood favorite, might stir something warm inside her daughter. But every gesture seemed to fall into an invisible void, swallowed by a silence that grew thicker with each passing hour. Grace came home later and later, sometimes entering the house with a sigh heavy enough to push Evelyn a step back without a single word being spoken. And each night, Evelyn would hear her daughter close the bedroom door with a soft but final click, a sound that carried the ache of emotional distance more clearly than any sentence could. One afternoon, Evelyn attempted what little courage she still had. She knocked gently on Grace's bedroom door, not to intrude, not to scold, but simply to ask if they could have dinner together. Just the two of them, like old times. When Grace finally opened the door, her face held a mixture of impatience and exhaustion, the kind you reserve for someone who wears you down instead of lifting you up. "Mom, I can't right now," she said sharply. "I'm tired. I've had a long day. And honestly, I need space." Space. That word again, sharp enough to cut, heavy enough to bruise. Evelyn nodded and stepped back, swallowing the sting in her throat, her chest tightening with the familiar, suffocating ache of being unwanted in a place she once considered home. She returned to the guest room where the air felt colder than usual, where the walls felt too close, where loneliness sat beside her like an old friend. That evening, while tidying the living room, Evelyn noticed an envelope on the coffee table, a bill with Grace's name on it. Without thinking, she slipped a few folded bills inside. Money she had saved from her small retirement funds, money she had planned to use sparingly to avoid burdening her daughter. When Grace discovered it later instead of gratitude, there was irritation. "Mom, I don't need your money," she snapped, tossing the envelope aside. "I need you to stop interfering." The words landed heavy, each one like a quiet rejection, a subtle reminder that her presence was no longer welcome the way it once was. Evelyn stood there, stunned, the warmth draining from her face. She had raised a daughter who once believed her mother hung the moon, who used to run into her arms crying after scraped knees or nightmares, a daughter who once thought love meant closeness. But now love seemed to mean distance, space, independence, silence. That night when Evelyn lay in bed, staring at the faint glow of the hallway light slipping through the crack under the door, she allowed herself to feel the weight of the truth she had been avoiding. She wasn't just last in Grace's life. She was fading entirely, slipping quietly from a place of love into a place of polite tolerance. And as she closed her eyes, her heart aching with a sadness too deep to name, she wondered if children ever understood the loneliness that lives inside parents when their love is no longer returned, or if this ache was simply the silent destiny of every mother who gave too much. As the days drifted by like slow-moving shadows, Evelyn began noticing small signs, tiny cracks in her daughter's kindness that grew wider with each passing moment, revealing a truth she had never imagined she would face in her old age. Grace no longer waited for her to finish speaking. She cut her off mid-sentence with a sigh or a dismissive wave of her hand. She no longer asked how Evelyn felt, how she slept, how her aching knees were holding up. Instead, her words turned clipped, transactional, as if Evelyn were a distant acquaintance rather than the woman who had once slept on a couch for years just so her daughter could have the only bedroom in their old apartment. One afternoon, Evelyn overheard Grace on the phone in the kitchen, speaking in a hushed but urgent tone. "I can't keep doing this," Grace whispered sharply. "She's always here. I feel suffocated. I need my freedom back." The words stopped Evelyn in her tracks. She felt them like a punch to the chest, stealing her breath. Her hands trembled around the laundry she had been folding, the fabric slipping slowly from her fingers. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop. She had simply walked by at the wrong moment. But once she heard those words, she couldn't unhear them. Freedom. As if her mother's presence was a prison gate. That evening, Grace came home irritated, moving through the house with sharp gestures and a tight jaw, slamming the cabinet doors louder than necessary. Evelyn approached her gently, hoping to ease her mood. "Is everything all right, sweetheart?" she asked softly. Grace turned to her with an exhausted glare. "Mom, please stop asking that. Everything isn't about you." Evelyn froze. The words struck like ice water poured straight down her spine. After a long breath, Grace continued, her voice lower but no kinder. I need space. I need a life. I need you to understand that I can't take care of everything alone." But Evelyn hadn't asked her daughter to take care of everything. She had been trying not to be a burden, trying to clean, cook, help, support, trying desperately to be useful. Yet somehow her attempts to lighten Grace's load only seemed to add to an invisible weight. The next morning, Evelyn found a pamphlet on the kitchen counter. An assisted living brochure. Bright colors, smiling elderly people. The words, "A place for comfort and independence." Her heart cracked open in a way she had never felt before. Not with anger, not with betrayal, but with a deep aching sadness, the kind that sits quietly inside your chest and refuses to leave. She didn't confront Grace. She didn't ask questions. She simply folded the pamphlet and placed it neatly back where she found it, hands trembling the entire time. That night, unable to sleep, she walked silently to the living room and stood near the window, watching the soft glow of the streetlights outside. The world felt distant, unreachable. Families walked their dogs, neighbors chatted on porches, a couple laughed while carrying groceries. Ordinary moments of connection that felt like memories from a life she once belonged to but no longer recognized. As she stood there in the silence, Evelyn felt something inside her begin to change. Not a dramatic shift, but a slow, painful realization that stitched itself into her heart. When someone shows you repeatedly that your presence is too heavy for them to carry, it isn't love to stay and beg for space in their world. Sometimes, love is stepping back quietly, even when it breaks you. And for the first time, Evelyn understood that the wound she felt wasn't from being forgotten. It was from finally seeing the truth she had spent months trying not to see. A week later, the distance between Evelyn and her daughter had grown so wide that even the simplest interactions felt strained, as if they were two people forced to coexist in a space that no longer had room for both. One evening, Grace came home later than usual, frustration etched across her face, her movements sharp and restless as she dropped her keys on the table and tossed her bag onto the couch without a word. Evelyn, who had spent the entire day preparing a small dinner in hopes of easing the tension between them, stepped forward gently and said, "I made something warm for you, sweetheart." But Grace didn't look at her. She didn't even slow down. Instead, she muttered, "Mom, I'm not hungry." Her tone cold, final, and dripping with exhaustion that sounded far older than her years. Evelyn stood still, hands clasped tightly in front of her, watching as Grace walked past her. Past the table, past the meal, past the quiet love laid out in the form of warm soup and freshly baked bread. The rejection wasn't loud or dramatic, but it hit harder than any shouted argument could have. A subtle kind of pain that slips into the cracks of your heart and settles there like frost. Later that night, Grace emerged from her room, eyes red and swollen, and for a moment, Evelyn thought perhaps her daughter had been crying. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer comfort the way mothers do instinctively, but Grace raised a hand sharply, stopping her. "Mom, we need to talk." The words hung heavy in the air. Evelyn felt the room tilt slightly. Grace took a deep, shaky breath before continuing. "I can't do this anymore. I feel trapped. I feel like I'm living someone else's life. I need my own space, my own time, my own home back." Evelyn's chest tightened. "Grace, I never wanted to make your life harder." Grace exhaled sharply. "But you have. Mom, I love you, but your being here, it changes everything. I can't relax. I can't breathe. It's like you're everywhere. Everywhere." Evelyn felt those words sink into her like a stone in deep water. She had spent decades being everything for her daughter, provider, comfort, protector. And now being everywhere was a burden she was being asked to erase. In that moment, Grace pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket and placed it on the table with trembling fingers. It was the assisted living application form. "I went to look at a place today," Grace said quietly. It's nice. Clean. Safe. They have activities, nurses, everything you might need." The world around Evelyn blurred. She reached for the back of a chair to steady herself, feeling her knees weaken. "You want me to leave?" Evelyn whispered. Her voice cracking under the weight of a truth Grace was too afraid to say out loud. Grace didn't deny it. Instead, she whispered, "I think it's best for both of us. For both of us." As if the decision were mutual. As if Evelyn had ever even considered leaving. Evelyn stared down at the paper, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. She thought of all the nights she stayed awake when Grace was a child, nursing her fevers, holding her after nightmares, working long hours to afford school supplies and birthday cakes. She thought of all the sacrifices she had made willingly, lovingly. And now those years felt like they were being packed neatly into a file folder and replaced with a room in a facility filled with strangers. She looked up at her daughter, really looked, and for the first time she saw not just a stressed adult but a woman who had quietly closed the door on the mother who raised her. That night, Evelyn returned to the guest room, but she didn't lie down. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands trembling, eyes burning, staring at the soft shadows dancing on the wall. Her breath came slow and uneven, and she realized something she had never allowed herself to admit before. Sometimes the hardest part of motherhood isn't letting your children grow up. It's realizing they've grown away from you. The next morning, the air inside the house felt heavier than Evelyn had ever known. As if overnight the walls themselves had absorbed the tension and were now pressing it back onto her with every breath she took. She moved slowly through the hallway, her steps soft, careful, each one echoing with the painful truth that she had tried to ignore for too long. Grace barely glanced at her as she prepared herself for work, her movements rushed, mechanical, as though simply being in the same room as her mother stretched her patience thin. Evelyn stood quietly near the counter, hands trembling slightly as she poured tea, the steam rising in soft curls that blurred her vision. She wanted to speak, to address the previous night's conversation, to ask if they could find another way, any way, that didn't involve her being removed from the home she had once helped build. But before she could form the words, Grace sighed sharply, rubbing her temples. "Mom, please don't start today," she muttered, not even looking up. "I can't handle another emotional conversation right now." Another emotional conversation. As if Evelyn's entire existence had been reduced to nothing more than a dramatic inconvenience. She lowered her gaze, swallowing the ache that rose in her throat, and simply nodded. When Grace finally left, closing the door behind her with a final click, the house fell into a stillness that felt deeper than silence. Evelyn wandered from room to room, brushing her fingers softly over surfaces, tiny reminders of a life she once felt part of. The framed pictures on the shelf, the coffee mug Grace used every morning, the couch they had shared during countless movie nights long ago. She wondered if memories feel pain when they are forgotten, or if only people do. Later in the afternoon there was a knock at the door, unexpected, soft, cautious. When Evelyn opened it, she found a woman standing there, dressed neatly, holding a clipboard, wearing the kind of overly gentle smile that made Evelyn's heart sink. "Hello, Mrs. Dawson," the woman said warmly. "I'm Mary. I'm from the Assisted Living Center. Your daughter mentioned I could stop by to answer any questions." Evelyn's breath faltered. Grace had invited them, not to discuss with her but to move things forward without her. She stepped aside silently, allowing Mary in. The woman walked through the house with practiced eyes, gently pointing out what amenities the facility offered. Daily meals, medical staff, activities, companionship. Her voice flowed smoothly, her tone kind, but to Evelyn it all sounded distant, hollow, like someone reading the description of a life she did not choose. When Mary left, she placed a brochure on the table with a soft pat. "It's a lovely place," she said. "You'd fit in wonderfully." Fit in. The phrase felt like a bandage placed over a wound still bleeding. Fit in somewhere else. Fit in away from her daughter. That evening when Grace returned, Evelyn stood quietly near the living room window, the brochure still sitting untouched on the coffee table. "Mary came by," Evelyn said softly. Grace froze. Her shoulders tensed and she let out a long breath. "Mom, I didn't want it to be a shock," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I need to know you'll be taken care of. That's all." Evelyn felt her heartbeat slow, heavy. "Grace, am I really that much of a burden?" she whispered. Grace closed her eyes, her expression tightening with guilt, frustration, and exhaustion tangled together. "Mom," she said quietly, I just need my life back." Those words settled into Evelyn's chest with a cold finality. She turned away slowly, hiding the tremble in her lips. Later, in the guest room, she sat on the edge of her bed, fingers knotted tightly together, the room spinning with memories she couldn't bear to revisit. She looked at the small suitcase she had brought months ago, a suitcase she had once believed she would unpack permanently, and realized it had never really been opened fully, as if some quiet part of her had always known this day would come. And in that moment, a truth whispered through her heart like a quiet wind. Sometimes love does not fade in grand explosions. Sometimes it simply erodes, grain by grain, until one day, you look up and realize there is no place left for you in the life of the person you raised. The following weekend arrived like a slow-moving storm, heavy and inevitable, and Evelyn felt its weight long before anything actually happened. Grace had been quieter than usual all day, moving around the house with the distracted agitation of someone preparing for a difficult conversation but pretending everything was normal. Evelyn sensed it immediately, the way a mother senses everything. Yet she kept her hands busy in the kitchen, slicing fruit, wiping counters, pretending she didn't notice the nervous glance Grace kept sending her way. She hoped, foolishly, that maybe her daughter had changed her mind, that maybe the heaviness in her eyes meant regret, not confirmation of the decision Evelyn feared most. But by afternoon, Grace finally spoke, her voice trembling slightly as she stood near the dining table. "Mom, can we sit for a minute?" she asked softly, and Evelyn knew before she even turned around that this moment would change everything. She walked slowly to the chair opposite Grace, her heartbeat steady but heavy, her palms already damp. Grace took a deep breath, her fingers fidgeting with the strap of her watch, eyes refusing to meet her mother's. "I talked to the assisted living center again," she began carefully. "They have a room ready next week. They said we could do the paperwork tomorrow." The words floated between them, soft yet devastating, like feathers dipped in ice. Evelyn felt her throat tighten, but she didn't interrupt. She let Grace continue, even as each sentence felt like another piece of her being quietly chipped away. "Mom, please understand," Grace said, her voice wavering. "I'm drowning. I can't work, manage my life, and take care of everything here. I need balance. I need my space back. You deserve proper care. Regular meals, nurses, activities, people your age. People your age. Proper care. Space." Words wrapped like silk around a blade. Evelyn stared at her daughter, really stared, and saw not cruelty but exhaustion. Not hatred, but someone choosing herself over the woman who had chosen her every day for decades. She felt the sadness settle deep into her ribs, familiar now like a shadow she had grown used to carrying. "Grace," she whispered, her voice fragile, "I never wanted to take your life away. I only wanted to be close to you." Grace closed her eyes, guilt flashing briefly, but she pushed forward. "I know, Mom. But this is what's best. For both of us." Those words, "for both of us," felt like a rehearsed lie, something Grace had convinced herself of so she could push down the guilt long enough to go through with the decision. Evelyn nodded slowly, even though her heart was breaking in ways she couldn't express. A strange calm washed over her, not acceptance but surrender. There is a difference, and Evelyn felt it clearly. Acceptance is peaceful, surrender is silent heartbreak. Later that evening, when Grace had retreated to her room and the house had fallen into its usual uneasy quiet, Evelyn walked into the living room and sat in her daughter's favorite armchair, letting the soft lamplight wrap gently around her tired frame. She looked at the framed photos on the wall, Grace's graduation, her first job, birthdays, accomplishments, and realized she wasn't in most of them. She had been behind the camera, making those moments possible. She had always been behind everything. Every success, every comfort, every milestone. And now she was being quietly moved to the edges of her daughter's life, replaced by convenience and quiet spaces. Evelyn clasped her hands tightly, staring at the canvas painting Grace once made as a child. A little girl and her mother holding hands under a cartoon tree, and she felt a tear slide down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She let it fall because it belonged there. And in that still moment, she finally understood the brutal truth of motherhood. Sometimes the greatest pain comes not from what your child says, but from the moment you realize they no longer see you as someone worth staying close to. The morning they left for the assisted living facility was colder than usual, the sky gray and heavy as if the world itself understood what was happening. Evelyn sat quietly in the passenger seat of Grace's car, her hands resting gently on her lap, fingers intertwined as if holding on to herself. Grace drove with forced calm, her jaw tense, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them was louder than any argument they could have had. When they reached the facility, a neat, polished building with painted flowers on the windows and a smiling receptionist, Evelyn felt a strange lightness in her chest, not from comfort, but from the surreal detachment that comes when a heartbreak becomes too big to fully feel. Grace helped her check in, signed the papers, walked her through the small room with the neatly made bed and the tiny window showing a patch of trees outside. "Mom, I'll visit you often," Grace said, her voice tight with guilt. Evelyn smiled gently, the kind of smile mothers give when they know their children are lying to themselves more than anyone else. "Of course, sweetheart," she whispered, even though she already knew the truth. Visits would come less and less, Calls would be shorter, and eventually Evelyn would become a quiet thought at the edge of Grace's busy life. After a long hug that felt more like a farewell than comfort, Grace finally left, her footsteps fading down the hallway. Evelyn stood by the window, watching the trees sway in the cold breeze, and let out a slow breath. For the first time in a long time, she didn't fight the grief. She let it settle, let it soak through her bones like rain through old soil. She realized something painful yet clear. Love is not always enough to keep people close. Sometimes life, exhaustion, and self-preservation win. And sometimes being a mother means accepting heartbreaks your children will never understand. Days passed slowly. Evelyn watched other residents receive flowers, cards, warm visits. She smiled for them, never envying, only observing. She took part in activities, listened to soft music, tried to adjust, but the ache in her chest never truly lifted. One quiet afternoon, as sunlight filtered gently through her small window, Evelyn sat in her chair with a blanket over her knees, her breathing calm, her hands folded peacefully. A nurse walking by noticed the stillness and stepped inside. "Mrs. Harper," she called softly. Evelyn didn't answer. She had slipped away, quietly, gently, like a tired bird settling into its final rest. There was no struggle, no fear, just a calm ending to a life that had given everything and asked for nothing. When Grace arrived later, her face pale and shattered, she stood trembling beside the bed. She touched her mother's cool hand and whispered a broken apology that came too late. Tears fell, but Evelyn was beyond hearing them now. It was only then, only in that moment of irreversible loss, that Grace finally understood the truth her mother had carried silently all her life. Love is not measured by convenience or comfort. It is measured by presence, by sacrifice, by choosing someone even when it is hard. Grace wept over the hand that once fed her, held her, comforted her, protected her. She wept for the distance she created, for the time she stole from her own mother's last years. And somewhere in the quiet room, in the soft glow of fading sunlight, the universe held its breath and whispered the final lesson Evelyn had lived and died with. A mother's heart breaks, but it never stops loving. Not even at the end.